Wonderful to have you all with us. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Asia Society. Welcome once again to our global online platform and to our special programming being done in conjunction with this year's virtual edition of the United Nations General Assembly sessions. I was going to say here in New York, but of course, given that they're virtual, they're not necessarily here in New York any more than this program is. This is, of course, a very unusual time. The halls up at the UN are pretty bare. The traffic in this city, at least around the United Nations, is nothing like what it normally is. But this year, as in other years, the UN is hosting critical meetings. It's the organization's 75th anniversary year. And as always, we are proud at the Asia Society to welcome leaders from Asia to our stage, be it virtual or otherwise. Earlier today, we had a conversation with the Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates, reflecting on the groundbreaking normalization of relations with Israel. And earlier this week, China's Chief Minister for Climate Change was with us. He made news in his conversation with the president of our Policy Institute, Kevin Rudd, about new commitments that China has made this week in terms of lowering its carbon emissions and carbon output. And in a moment, we will be joined by Her Excellency, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea. Just a couple of words about Asia Society events. Our calendar of top-tier events is always busy. It's always accessible via our website at asiasociety.org. And I just want to mention one event. We were just talking a moment ago with Minister Kang. The Asia Game Changer Awards will be held on October 22nd, a little less than a month from now, also virtually, and a truly global celebration in a year that obviously we haven't had much to celebrate. We will be joined by Yo-Yo Ma, by tennis champion Naomi Osaka, Joe and Clara Tsai, Vikas Khanna, and representing Korea. Korea is overrepresented this year. The K-pop megastars BTS will be with us, and also the entertainment impresario, Mickey Lee. Much more. It all happens on the evening, US time, of October 22nd, the morning of October 23rd in Asia, and again, much more at our website. But now let's get to our very special guest for this event. Her Excellency Kang Kyung-wha is Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Korea. She previously served as Senior Advisor on Policy to the United Nations Secretary General. Also at the UN, she was Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator and Assistant Secretary General at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy High Commissioner at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Among many diplomatic posts for her country, she has served as Ambassador at Large for Global Affairs, Director General for International Organizations, and Minister at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations. Leading the conversation today, my colleague, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Daniel Russel, who served in many capacities as a top diplomat during a long career as a diplomat for the United States, but most relevant for tonight's event, he was, among other things, President Obama's point person for issues pertaining to the Korean Peninsula. We will begin with brief remarks from Minister Kang, and then Danny Russell will moderate the conversation. He'll take your questions, and a reminder that you can submit questions depending on the platform you're on, either via the comment functions at YouTube or Facebook. Once again, delighted to have you all with us wherever you may be watching, and please welcome to the Asia Society Global Platform, Her Excellency, from the Republic of Korea, Minister Kang Kyung-wha. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and you can be sure that I will be tuning in for the Asia Game Changers Award. I'm a huge fan of BTS and Mickey Lee both. Executive Vice President, Mr. Tom Nagorski, Vice President, Mr. Daniel Russel, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to the Asia Society's virtual seminar on the occasion of the 75th General Assembly. I'm delighted with this opportunity to share Korea's experience in dealing with COVID-19 and our outlook on the changing global landscape in the midst of the pandemic. Korea has been touted as somewhat of a success story when it comes to COVID-19, and I can only thank my colleagues in disease control, public health, and central and local administrations for this. They have indeed been doing a remarkable job. But today's success is not a guarantee for success in the long run because COVID-19 is very tricky and very much an ongoing story. Globally, the pandemic has claimed over 31 million victims so far and is still spreading. At around 250,000, the daily toll of new cases is not visibly slowing down yet, and thousands of lives are being lost to the virus every day. It is resurging in many countries with waves that are even higher and bigger than the first. Korea, too, is currently emerging from a second wave after weeks of concerted efforts to contain it. And we are bracing ourselves for the very real possibility of more waves as the cooler months approach. Furthermore, even if we are succeeding, others also have to be succeeding. For an open and free country like Korea, that greatly depends on vibrant engagement with others in a rules-based international order. Let me first sum up some of the key features that have made for Korea's successes against COVID-19 so far. First, we were well prepared. We had beefed up our infectious disease control regime based on some painful lessons learned from previous failures. After the debacle over the MERS outbreak in 2015, the legal framework was strengthened to give more authority to the health and disease control experts. Manuals were thoroughly reviewed and updated. Support was doubled for R&D in viruses and infectious diseases. So we were ready to scale up our testing, tracing, and treatment regime, the 3 Ts, which are the basic ingredients in fighting any infectious disease. Most of all, we were very quick to develop and scale up the production of the test kits. We had the first test kits developed, approved, and ready for use by February 4th, barely 2 weeks after the first patient was identified. Since then, scores of test kits have been approved, and many are now being exported to other countries. Second, we have taken a whole-of-government approach in fighting COVID-19. Since late February, the Prime Minister has been chairing the daily meeting of the COVID-19 Response and Management Committee with all relevant government ministries, including the Foreign Ministry and the 17 provincial governors and city mayors participating. The daily conversation at the highest level between the central and local administrations has been instrumental in keeping track of the virus spread, identifying problems and finding solutions, pooling medical and administrative resources, and staying unified on messaging to the public. Third, we have stuck to the principles that define us as a democracy: openness, transparency, civic activism, and innovativeness. Rather than closing down, internally with lockdowns or externally with border closures, we have kept society open and borders open, with restrictions phased in and out only as necessary and proportionate to the risk of the virus spread. Transparency has meant full disclosure with the public about what the government is doing or not doing, what we know or don't know based on evidence and science. Civic activism has always been a strength of our country and has shined against COVID-19, especially in the volunteers that made up for the lack of manpower and innovative solutions that complemented government measures. For example, the drive-through and walk-through testing stations were doctors' ideas that were adopted and scaled up by the government. Private citizens developed smartphone applications that provided real-time information about the closest pharmacy where certified facial masks can be bought. The downside has been the spread of groundless rumors, false information, and hostility toward minority groups on the social media, which we have been trying to track down and delete in collaboration with the service providers. The steadfast adherence to these principles has won the trust of the public in government action. Generally speaking, democracies are full of diverse and divisive voices, and we embrace this as an inherent part of life. Some critics and detractors have refused to cooperate with the government's COVID-19 measures. Indeed, they were the major source of the outbreak that led to the second wave. Some still refuse, and stubborn non-cooperation can only be dealt with strict law enforcement. But this goes to further underscore the importance of trust between the protector and the protected in crisis response. Without trust, success is not possible even with the most advanced disease control tools. Fourth, we have adhered to the same principles of openness, transparency, and trust in our COVID-19 related engagement with other countries. As one of the first countries to be hit by the pandemic, we were compelled to deal with the multifaceted socioeconomic challenges that COVID-19 has entailed: social distancing, airport quarantine, keeping track of inbound travelers, online schooling, elections, and so forth. And we have readily shared our experience through countless webinars and video conferences. We've been able to meet many requests for humanitarian assistance, even as our budget has been extremely stretched by domestic economic stimulus packages. We are restructuring our development assistance with key partners to focus on the public health sector. We have actively participated in regional and global discussions to shore up political and financial solidarity to overcome the pandemic and its devastating fallout. We've also been working with willing partners to maintain essential travel of people in the midst of closed borders and canceled air flights. These exchanges are essential to the well-being of our economies and societies. They are also the building blocks in restoring the global solidarity that has been sorely tested by the pandemic. On vaccines, we are actively participating in the COVAX facility led by the WHO and Gavi, which is designed to finance vaccine development and production through collective funding and purchasing. Our goal must be to support equitable and adequate access to treatments and vaccines for all countries. How much we succeed in this will set the tone for the future of multilateral work, not only in the global health sector, but for multilateralism overall. As we ponder the world beyond COVID-19, I would draw the broad contours of Korea's foreign policy along the following key points. First, we will be an active player in revitalizing multilateralism. Korea owes much of its national development as a liberal democracy and open market economy to the rules-based multilateral international order, and we are very concerned about the waning confidence in multilateralism. The trend began long before COVID-19, but the pandemic has exacerbated it. Indeed, COVID-19 has exposed the inherent vulnerability of existing multilateral institutions and the global governance system. The divisive member states' dynamics at the WHO in the aftermath of the outbreak undermined efforts to forge the much-needed global solidarity in tackling the crisis. But the pandemic has also made clear that cross-border threats like infectious diseases require close collaboration with others. A country cannot be safe if its neighbors, far or near, are not safe from the threats. Enlightened self-interest would have countries actively contributing to the safety of their neighbors. And motivated by such enlightened self-interest and with focus and realism, rather than mere aspiration, we can turn this crisis into an opportunity to breathe new energy into multilateralism. The role of middle powers is crucial in this process, more so as the big power rivalry inside and outside the multilateral settings is becoming more intense. Korea strives to facilitate the formation of like-minded coalitions and build solidarity among middle power countries that share universal values such as democracy, the market economy, and human rights. Thus, we have joined the Alliance for Multilateralism, which is an informal network of more than 50 countries that seek to shore up multilateral institutions. We have also joined up with like-minded member states in New York, Geneva, and Paris to support the pandemic-related work of UN entities. Second, the ROK-US Alliance will remain the linchpin of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and the anchor of Korea's foreign and security policy. Over the past 7 decades, the relationship has grown from a military alliance to a comprehensive alliance of shared values and interests, and thriving ties between our two peoples. COVID-19 has brought us together. The Korean government has spared no effort to support the United States, airlifting hundreds and thousands of testing kits, providing millions of face masks to FEMA, as well as to American veterans of the Korean War. Having successfully held nationwide elections in April, we have shared that experience with US election officials at the federal and state levels. Remarkably, we have kept our borders fully open to travelers from each side. This stands out as an exception amidst all the entry bans and restrictions that remain in place around the world, standing testimony to the exceptional nature of our relationship. Third, we will stay the course with the Korean Peninsula peace process based on the close coordination with the United States and our neighbors. Even though the process has been stalled for a while, we cannot underestimate the milestone agreements reached between the leaders of South Korea, the United States, and North Korea in 2018 to achieve complete denuclearization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. In the meanwhile, we have offered inter-Korean cooperation in fighting COVID-19 and future pandemics. After all, from the viewpoint of the viruses or other cross-border threats, South and North Korea is a single ecosystem. The logic also applies to the larger region. Thus, President Moon has proposed to launch a Northeast Asia cooperation initiative for infectious disease control and public health that would bring North Korea together with China, Japan, Mongolia, and South Korea to work together against diseases and other disasters. North Korea's stonewalling of our call to dialogue and offer of assistance on COVID-19 has tested our patience. Earlier this week, its Navy shot dead and burned the body of a South Korean fisheries official who had drifted north in the West Sea. We are trying to ascertain how and why he drifted north. We have condemned this shocking and inhuman act by the North Korean military and urged Pyongyang to thoroughly investigate the crime and punish the perpetrators. The terrible incident underscores the difficulty of engaging with North Korea, a closed and insulated country whose behavior is often unacceptable and must be told so. But with the abiding support of the international community for our efforts, and based on the solid combined defense posture of the ROK-US alliance, we will stay the course in pursuit of our goal of complete denuclearization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. And let me close my beginning remarks there, and I'm now happy to engage in the interaction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Minister Kang, thanks so much. First of all, thanks for joining us today during Virtual UNGA Week, but also thanks for your very clear and informative remarks. I love your insights. Without trust, you won't have success. So, spoken like an experienced international diplomat. And speaking of which, you made a very effective case for multilateralism. I can't resist mentioning that I, early in my career, played a tiny role in the ROK, the South Korean accession to full UN membership in the early 90s when I served at the US mission to the UN. And listening to you reminds me just how valuable that turned out to be for the entire world. So thanks. I'm going to start with a few questions of my own, but the audience on Facebook and YouTube is starting to send in questions on social media, and I'll be sure to fold those in. Now, Minister, you began by talking about COVID-19, and so maybe I could start there as well, particularly as it relates to US-South Korea relations. You know, the UN obviously is marking its 75th anniversary now in the middle of this brutal pandemic. I think we're just past 1 million deaths. But when you look at our two countries, it's such a dramatic study in contrasts. As you described, you know, despite a second wave, South Korea has moved very quickly, efficiently through digital contact tracing, manufactured tests, used masks, transparency, close cooperation with the WHO. I think you've had fewer than, or just around 23,000 cases, fewer than 400 deaths. And in contrast, the United States, with more than 7 million cases, just passed the 200,000 fatality mark. And by the way, has announced the withdrawal from the WHO. So it's probably no surprise that a recent poll found that where 86% of South Koreans say that their government, you, did a great job, 52% of Americans say that our government did a bad job. So could you talk a little bit about the effect of COVID on Korean public attitudes towards the US? Because I know that in democracies like ours, public attitudes can shape or limit our foreign policy options.
Well, thank you. I think, I think I already introduced a comment that indicated the depth and the width of the bilateral ties. I think I pointed to the maintenance of the flights between the two countries. 90 flights every week still carry, and I think some people are quite surprised that we have still planes flying between countries, but between the United States and Korea, it was extremely important that we maintain that that people-to-people exchange, family visits, business people, government officials. And I think is a clear indication, and nobody complains. On certain countries, there is public complaint that we have kept the ports open, and that we should close it down for people coming from certain countries. There's no comment about us having kept that door open for people-to-people exchanges with the United States. So that is a clear indication of the importance of this tie to the everyday people in our country. I will not pass judgment on how other governments have dealt with this, and the evaluation from their own public, but certainly the United States is a much bigger country than us. It's a federal system. We are a country that has a very highly wired public health infrastructure to begin with, and that's been very helpful. But I always say, even with all that wiring, if we didn't really systematically, patiently, methodically try to build this trust with full transparency, none of these tools would matter all that much. Because I also know of countries where they have very few of these digital tools, but just by the patient effort on the authorities to build that trust, and asking people to wear masks and do social distancing, and the public adhering to the public guidance, they have very much been able to curb the spread of the virus. The trust is the key ingredient, as it is in any disaster response. But the core point of your question about this, I think COVID-19 has added to that specialness between the United States and the Republic of Korea.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because there was a Pew poll last month that found that South Koreans holding favorable views of the United States has actually dropped over the last 4 years from 84% to 59% today, and that the percentage of South Korean citizens who say they have confidence in the US president has gone from 88% to a pretty worrisome 17% today. I don't want to politicize the conversation, but as foreign minister, and you've been foreign minister for much of this time, beyond COVID, how does the change in public attitudes in your society affect our bilateral ties?
I think we are an alliance that has a strong history of having solved difficult issues together. One pending issue is the special measures agreement, whereby Korea pays for some of the cost the U.S. troops stationed here on the Korean Peninsula. We've had this arrangement since 1991, and over a period of several rounds, our share of that cost has increased, as it should, because our economy and our wealth has continued to grow. It was something like 150 million at the beginning of the 1990s. Last year, it was nearly $1 billion. So yes, our contribution have increased over the years. The current round, which is still pending after intense negotiations, hasn't been resolved yet, hasn't reached agreement yet. And I think the public frustration with the lack of agreement, the positions remain still very much apart. And as government, we don't ascertain or give out any concrete numbers, but with many reports coming out on some of those concrete numbers indicating a request for a huge increase from the United States, I think this is a big part of the dissatisfaction on the part of the public, because it's important that we have this agreement. We have found a solution in the interim so that part of the arrangement continues even without the agreement, and that's the Korean workers who work for the U.S. troops here. They're continuing to work because we found an agreement to continue this. And I think that anything with the United States is an important issue here. It's vigorously discussed. There are views are expressed. And the SMA, of course, is a very important issue. So I think that has fed the frustration and negative sentiment on the part of our public. And we listen very carefully and pay much attention, because in the end, this is something that we need to pass through the National Assembly, and where, of course, public sentiment matters a great deal.
Well, I think that your point about the importance of public support for not only the alliance, but stationing of U.S. forces on Korean soil is so important. And in my career as a diplomat serving in South Korea, but also handling U.S. policy for Asia, I learned without any doubt that we are guests in your country, and that we have to be attentive to the needs and the views and the wishes of the people there. You may be understating a little bit South Korea's prowess in negotiations. I think from what I've heard, President Trump started with a demand for a 500% increase in the special measures agreement, and I think you've whittled him down to at least a 50% increase. But as you point out, there's still a long way to go. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you if you're waiting to see if Trump gets reelected or how this is going to play out, because the bigger issue, frankly, is not the money. It's the ability of the U.S. forces in Korea, in partnership with South Korea's military, 같이 갑시다, to effectively deter aggression, to defend the ROK, and to maintain stability not only on the peninsula but in the region as well. And it's no secret that our president has complained that allies have, well, let's say, taken the United States for a ride, that Americans have been suckers for defending other democracies, and that makes allies freeloaders and so on. And you don't have to read that in John Bolton's book or Bob Woodward's book, because what the president has talked about more than once publicly is the idea of withdrawing US troops from South Korea. He's already announced a drawdown in Germany. Secretary Esper didn't deny press reports that the Pentagon had been tasked to provide options for a partial withdrawal of troops. And I know that people like me who pay attention to security issues in the region are very concerned. And I wonder, what would the reaction be in South Korea if President Trump, in fact, signaled that he was going to follow through on that threat?
Well, diplomats don't respond to ifs or hypotheticals, but I can tell you that this is not a matter of discussion between our two militaries. And we expect every issue to be and the conclusion to be the result of close consultations between our two militaries and governments. But I am, of course, absolutely confident about the mutual interest of this alliance and the troop stationing here in terms of the U.S. strategic security interest, but also, of course, South Korea's security interest. And, we make sure that the combined defense posture of that alliance here materially, visibly is maintained at the solid level.
Well, I'm certainly with you on that, as I think most of the national security establishment in the United States is. So thank you. What we are trying to defend against and what we are seeking to deter is the threat posed by North Korea and its aggressive accumulation of nuclear weapons, of ballistic missiles, and so on. So I'd like to talk a little bit about North Korea and hear what you think. I know that we heard President Moon, again, in his UNGA address this year, talk about how the international community can help to end the Korean War, as you yourself described. Almost at the same time, North Korea shot and killed a South Korean citizen at sea and then burned his body. There's been an effort to pursue a peace process under the Moon administration. We're 2 years out from the Pyongyang joint declaration. Could you give us your assessment of the situation on the Korean Peninsula? You mentioned a bit of a stalemate in some areas, but what's the scorecard, would you say?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think post Hanoi, where the U.S. and the North Korean leaders could not reach an agreement on the denuclearization track, there have been efforts to revive that. Unfortunately, it hasn't made progress. We have tried to pick up the South North Korea track, and these two go in parallel, complements each other, but both tracks have been stalled, and it's frustrating. But both the United States and we have made, we remain ready to re-engage in dialogue. Of course, we watch very carefully through whatever information and intelligence means that we have the developments in North Korea, particularly their nuclear missiles program. But our offer of dialogue remains. I think this year has been particularly difficult for North Korea. It says it doesn't have any COVID-19 cases. Hard to believe. I think we have to proceed assuming that there would be cases in North Korea. But the pandemic has meant North Korea completely closing down. Whatever limited interaction that it has had with the outside world, including the trading on the northern border with China. So it is an indication that they're having a hard time with this. Added to that, the summer months have been brutal with floods and heavy showers. So the messages is coming out from the North Korea seems to be that they're very much focused on internal matters, addressing these issues and assuring the public that the leadership is actively dealing with these issues. A key point to watch will be what they want to send to the outside world in terms of the messages on October 10th, which is the anniversary of their Communist Party founding. but they have also publicly committed to announcing a new plan for economic revival at the early days of next year. So there are public engagements, public days that we need to see where the thinking is going. But we certainly hope, and we are very much doing our messaging so that it encourages, urges North Korea to come back to the dialogue table towards denuclearization and inter-Korean cooperation.
Thank you, Minister. And I fully understand that both the Republic of Korea and the United States remain ready, that we're watching closely, that we're ready for dialogue and so on. I accept also that North Korea's had a rough year, facing floods, facing COVID-19. But the question is whether, rather than making progress, not just in this year, but over the last 2+ years or longer, we've lost ground. I mean, North Korea blew up the inter-Korean liaison building. Kim Jong-un didn't visit Seoul as hoped. In fact, his own sister uses pretty disrespectful language, even when talking about your president. The COVID-19 aid that South Korea has offered was largely ignored. North Korea refuses to hold dialogue or family reunions. No progress really now in economic engagement. The military hotline is cut off. The US and the ROK canceled our joint exercises or scaled them down, but the North Koreans continued with theirs. And it's true, they've held off so far on new ICBM tests or new nuclear tests in the last 2 years, but they've gone ahead with submarine launched missiles and medium range missiles, and with a massive expansion of their nuclear arsenal. And now they're threatening a new strategic weapon, whatever that is. And they're doing a pretty good job of evading sanctions and of obtaining foreign currency through cyber theft and ransomware and so on. So I guess the question is, aren't we moving backwards? And is the situation likely to get better, even though we want to have dialogue?
Well, I think, as I said, engaging with this very closed and insular country is very, very difficult and frustrating, but it takes a lot of patience. I think, incidents have to be analyzed and studied for the implication for the longer term process, but the longer term process has to be peaceful engagement. We absolutely reject any military solutions to this. We are about consolidating peace and if possible, co-prosperity with North Korea, all within keeping with adhering to the UN sanctions regime. We asked for waivers where necessary, and we have received waivers for quite a number of our inter-Korean projects over the years, and we will continue to do so. But we're clear that the sanctions regime has to be adhered to, and we make that point with other countries as well. I think have we set back or have we moved forward? I think that judgment has to be made in the longer term. I think every time an incident like a few days ago happens, it certainly undermines our readiness and our goodwill, our patience. But I think in the end, in the longer term, we need to stay the course of peaceful engagement.
You mentioned, Minister, the upcoming 75th anniversary of the Korean Workers' Party, the October 10th celebration. And I know that North Korea has, in the past, at times used the big parade it holds on that holiday to roll out new weapons and so on. I wonder is that one of the signals that you had in mind, and do you have a prediction for what the signal will tell us on October the 10th?
Well, we'll see when October 10th rolls around. But beyond the usual activities, my military folks are really keeping close tabs on all the developments, in close information sharing with their US counterparts. But we will see when that day rolls around. But we certainly hope and urge North Korea for that signal to be one that is leading to constructive re-engagement rather than the other way.
Well, there too, I'm with you 100%. Maybe we could talk a little bit about regional diplomacy, and I'll get to one of the questions from our audience, which because South Korea has such complicated relations with its two biggest neighbors, Japan and China. Perhaps we could start with Japan, which has a brand new prime minister. I read that President Moon called the new Prime Minister Suga to congratulate him and made clear that he wants to work together to find a mutually acceptable solution to some of the outstanding problems in the bilateral relationship. So the question is the South Korean government willing to put anything on the table in its talks with Japan to try to get this renewed relationship off on a positive note, to try to reverse the downward spiral?
The conversation between the new prime minister and my president yesterday, I think, was a very positive one. And a change in leadership is always a good time to generate some positive dynamics. The issue of the past is the difficult, challenge, and more concretely, our Supreme Court ruling on the issue of forced labor. And as a democratic government, no government will go against the judgment of our highest legal authority, the Supreme Court. So there are certain musts that we must adhere to. That is making sure that judgment is respected and implemented, and the plaintiffs are awarded the reparations and compensations that they were awarded by the court. Within that parameter, we have been very creative in trying to find a way to meet those conditions while also addressing the Japanese position, which is that they don't accept this, that all claims have been settled by the 1965 claims agreement, which we disagree with, but given the different interpretations of the 65 agreement, we have tried to find the margins where we can meet, so that we meet our conditions and the Japanese are able to stay with their position. It's not that we've not been talking. We've been talking at various levels, officially, unofficially, and we will continue to do so. And I think that conversation yesterday, renewing that will on both sides to find a way forward has been a good start for my president and the prime minister. And as the foreign ministry, we will certainly work very closely with our counterparts to make sure that this renewed goodwill leads to some advances.
That's very encouraging, Minister. Thank you. So I'm taking away the sense that you feel that there is a renewed goodwill that could harness some of the creativity of Korean diplomacy to find a way to square the circle of the Korean Supreme Court ruling on forced labor compensation with the terms of the 1965 bilateral treaty. That would be wonderful. But there's another issue dogging the relationship from the past, that had at one point been addressed by the agreement on the so-called comfort women agreement. Is that something also that with a little creativity can be in some fashion revived?
Having thoroughly reviewed how that agreement came about, because the response of the public, no matter which side of the political spectrum, has been very critical inside the country. And so coming in, we took a very thorough review of how that agreement came about and concluded that this doesn't solve the issue, but that we will not ask to renegotiate or to break it, because it's not an issue to be resolved through diplomatic negotiations. I've talked to many of the victims, and these are very elderly ladies in their 80s, 90s, and we continue to lose them, one or two every year. Their number one ask is a sincere apology that is sincere when it's given and sincere, sustained sincerity. And I don't think the 2015 agreement offered them that. And so we are not going to negotiate with Japan on this issue, but we, as government, with the responsibility to protect these victims, although the pain was not caused by our government, we are doing what we can. We support them materially, mentally, physically, but we are also making sure that this issue of sexual violence in armed conflict and the comfort in women was one of the most egregious cases. We make sure that this stays on our foreign policy agenda, and that we play an active role in the women, peace, and security agenda at and around the United Nations.
Well, I'm not hearing quite the same level of encouragement about the potential for creative diplomacy to address that other major outstanding point of contention between Tokyo and Seoul. But I am heartened by the fact that in the phone call yesterday, President Moon said that South Korea and Japan are the closest of friends who share basic values and strategic interests, as well as partners that should cooperate for peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia. And I wondered if that suggests that South Korea might, in fact, be willing to join the so-called Quad Plus, the four major democracies besides South Korea in the region: US, India, Japan, Australia make up the Quad. Korea has not been part of that, but now the idea has been put forward that there could be a grouping of the Quad Plus. Is that something that the Korean government is open to?
Well, we don't think anything that automatically shuts out and as exclusive of the interest of others is a good idea. We've not been invited by the Quad to be a part of this. We are willing to engage in discussions on specific issues, but if that's a structure and a structured alliance, we would certainly think very hard about whether it serves our security interest. But on specific issues, we're, I think, very ready to have a discussion with whoever has an approach that is inclusive, open, and in accordance with international norms.
Mm-hmm. Well, the party that's excluded, obviously, is China, and that brings us to the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Beijing. And here again, I'm going to reach back into my personal history and say that I'm very proud that when I served at the UN in the 90s, in the same period I mentioned, I had a small hand also in helping to jumpstart the normalization process between Seoul and Beijing. But now the minister, the US-China relationship has deteriorated so dramatically that it puts many countries in the region, I think including the Republic of Korea, in a sometimes difficult position where Beijing is pulling in one direction and Washington is pulling in the other. I know from my own experience that countries in the region want to have it both ways. They want to get all the benefits of a good relationship with China, all the benefits of good relationship with the United States, and they certainly don't want to get caught in the crossfire. But I'm curious, as someone who, as foreign minister, is walking this tightrope, in the current environment, is that still realistic? Can Korea have it both ways?
Well, I don't think realistic or not is the answer. I think it's finding your own way. I think this idea of choice is not helpful. I think we are very clear that the anchor is the U.S. ROK alliance. But as you say, our strategic partnership with China, who is our biggest trading partner and economic partner, is also very important for our businessmen and people. So we juggle these issues and we deal with issue as they arise. But I think this is a challenge for all countries with the two biggest powers in a rivalry that continues to deepen and expand. I think you just have to see what your leverage is, and it's Korea's certainly in a geopolitical position that looks like if we are caught in the crossfire. But I think you can turn that around and say this is in fact a leverage. And as a middle power that is increasingly competent, we have partners elsewhere. And I think utilizing those partnerships with like-minded friends, like-minded countries, we will make sure that our interest, our security interests, and our economic interests are preserved and promoted.
Well, speaking of middle powers and speaking of like-minded friends, one of the questions we've got from our audience is about South Korea's relationship with Taiwan, another very effective case study in dealing with COVID-19. Recently, a senior US government official visited and attended the funeral for former President Lee Teng-hui, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Mori, similarly visited. The question is whether, Minister, you could tell us a little bit about the ROK's relationship with Taiwan and whether you think ties with Taiwan will expand and improve in light of your many common interests as fellow democracies.
I think Taiwan we very much adhere to the principle of one country, two systems. Our economic ties, our people-to-people ties with Taiwan is very rich, and we very much hope to keep it that way. But the international relations framework that have evolved over the past decades, I think needs to be preserved for the stability of this region, and we will certainly do so.
Well, we all have an interest in democracy, and we have an interest in stability, for sure. The other party with whom both China and the Republic of Korea have extraordinarily important relationships is, of course, North Korea. And Beijing, for a number of years, once Kim Jong-un came to power, has been pretty tough, particularly after the execution of Jang Song-tak. Beijing has been tough on North Korea, began in 2017 to really implement sanctions with a enthusiasm and a resolve that none of us had ever seen before. That stopped and China reversed course in 2018 once President Trump announced that he planned to meet directly with Kim Jong-un. And of course, Xi Jinping beat him to the punch by inviting Kim twice to Beijing. And there's kind of been no looking back. Since then, China's dramatically increased its support for North Korea. It's relaxed its enforcement of sanctions. It's resumed some assistance, some trade, given a lot more political support and cover to North Korea. How problematic is it from South Korea's point of view for China to have regained so much influence and reverted to the old model of backing Pyongyang?
I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. I think the simple conclusion that a reversal of course dramatically includes support have to be, I think, need to be taken into the larger context. China has been fully supportive of South-North engagement. It has said that, and it continues to say, it is abiding by the sanctions. It has called for an easing of the sanctions because its appraisal of how far North Korea has come in terms of the denuclearization track is, I would say, more generous than the rest of the rest of the world. But they have, and they don't publish what is given in terms of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. So we don't exactly know the scale, but we do know that trade relations have really frozen up. So how much is given needs more evidence to be certain about those things. But I think China has continued to say that U.S.-North Korea dialogue is important. U.S., South Korea, North Korea dialogue is important, and they continue to support this. We very much hope, and I think it makes sense. It's reasonable for China to stay that course because North Korea's denuclearization, tactically you may differ, but I think that strategic goal is very much in the interest of both the United States, China, and South Korea, and the region, in the world, in fact.
Absolutely. Well, Minister, China may be generous with its interpretation of North Korea's progress towards denuclearization, and it may be generous with its assistance to the DPRK, but you've been generous with your time and in sharing your wisdom with us. The hour has really flown by, at least for us. May have dragged out for you because I asked you some tough questions, but of course you were eminently capable of answering them, and you've given us a lot of insight into South Korea's approach to many of the tough and many of the important challenges that face us all and that you're working on. South Korea's soft power has won so many friends and admirers in the United States, on top of the large support that historically the ROK has enjoyed. But with the advent of popularized Korean food, we were talking earlier about K-pop and BTS. For me and for many people, I think it's watching Korean baseball with actual human beings in the stands that practically brings tears to the eyes of many Americans. And for me, having served at the United Nations like you, and having served at the US Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, I, for one, have a very deep admiration and respect for Korea's many terrific diplomats, and certainly for all that you do. So let me end, since it's 9 o'clock here, by thanking you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us. Thank you also for your service, and 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. It's been great to engage with you, and I certainly hope that we will be meeting in person very soon. Thank you.
I look